It's a new angle to Space Invaders as Atari Archive delves into the history of Defender. The so-called Golden Age of arcades kicked off in the West in 1978 and lasted until around 1983. In that time, some of the most popular and profitable video games ever produced for the coin-op space made their debut. Many of them were being published in the US by Atari and Midway, including some developed in Japan by companies such as Taito and Namco, games such as Space Invaders, Asteroids, and Pac-Man, among others. But there was also a monster success published in 1981 by the unassuming name of Defender, the first in-house video game from coin-op company Williams. For the unfamiliar, Defender is a shooter where the player's ship must protect 10 humanoids from being captured and turned into hyper-aggressive, speedy mutants by aliens. There are a variety of foes that menace you, such as the human-kidnapping landers, mine-laying bombers, pods and swarmers, and the fast-moving baiter that appears when you take too long. To help even the odds, the game includes screen-clearing smart bombs. As far as I'm aware, the first instance of what would become common in the shooting genre years down the line. The hyperspace button similar to the one in Asteroids, which will either warp you someplace randomly on the map or kill you outright. And speaking of the map, the action here takes place in a de facto Mobius strip that loops around on itself longer than the screen is wide. To help the player manage this relatively enormous space, a small radar screen is displayed at the top, and sound cues help identify when a humanoid is in trouble or when aliens are spawning in. You can also change directions to move from right to left, and effective use of the complex cabinet control scheme is crucial to surviving in this exceptionally difficult but very unique-looking game. If all the humans are killed or mutated, the world explodes and all of the landers become mutants, until the next time you reach the next wave that's a multiple of 5, when all the humans are restored. Williams existed long before Defender, and was probably one of the oldest surviving coin-op manufacturers still in business at the time, according to historian Keith Smith and his book All in Color for a Quarter. Williams was founded in 1929 by Harry Williams, who, after a few mediocre starts into the industry, picked up on the burgeoning pinball craze in the 1930s, and made a name for himself and his company in the ensuing decades with those and various electromechanical games. In 1959, Williams sold the company during a downturn, and it was sold again to Seeburg, a jukebox manufacturer. Under Seeburg's ownership, Williams dabbled in video games, contracting with Magnetic Corporation of America to publish Paddleball in 1973, a straightforward Pong clone. Williams attempted to get into video games again with Road Champion in 1977, but it wasn't until late 1979 that the company actively started work on a video game in-house. A significant member of this effort was Eugene Jarvis, who had picked up pinball as a kid and video games in his college years, playing Space War on an old computer at UC Berkeley. After a stint at Atari working in their pinball division, Jarvis found his way to Williams, working on pins there before joining their video game team early in 1980. The team designed a hardware platform capable of displaying 16 colors at a 320 by 256 resolution, which was fairly high-end for 1980 technology, but would help their games stand out as well as future-proof their hardware a little bit. Few game concepts went nowhere, Jarvis told Smith, such as a Space Invaders-style game where you shot diagonally, or an Asteroid-style game that used lower-resolution raster graphics. They realized the rotating ship in Asteroids doesn't work very well without the sharp vector lines of Atari's game, so they locked it to face right and allowed it to just fly forward and wrap around the screen. This was further tweaked by adding a scrolling landscape and the ability to reverse direction with the press of a button. Jarvis then hit on the central theme of the game, defending little people from the attackers, and with the arrival of Sam Dicker to design animations and the soundscape, Defender started coming together into a real game. 2 weeks before the game was due to be finished, Jarvis had the idea of turning the little humans into a gameplay element by having the aliens trying to kidnap them, and you having to save them and bring them safely back to the ground. This was extrapolated further into the idea of a lander getting away with a human, then merging with it to form a hyper-aggressive mutant. 2 more programmers, Paul Dassault and Larry DeMar, came in during the final week to help finish the game in time for the 1980 AMOA show, managing to get the game up and running with a demo build moments before the show opened. Defender went largely overlooked, but work continued on it for a couple more months to add more waves, and the additional wrinkle of all your humanoids being restored every 5th wave. When the game was finally location tested at Mother's Arcade, the team saw a line of kids angling to play it within a day. Upon the game's release in Europe in December and the US in February 1981, It rapidly rose in the charts, unseating Pac-Man as the top-grossing game and selling over 55,000 units by the time production ended. Defender became the best-selling game in Williams' history, grabbing at 12% of the coin-op video game market share in 1981, behind only Atari and Midway. It established it as a major player in the field. It also launched Jarvis into a coin-op game development career that, as of this writing, he is still in. Defender rapidly gained a reputation as a macho game designed for hardcore players and score chasers, to whom its intense difficulty and complex controls were a prevailing feature. Contemporary coverage suggests Defender was a huge hit for score chasers, a phenomenon that was reaching its zenith at the time, according to Alex Smith's book They Create Worlds. It was even the target of early high-score competitions. It is the game that sparked Twin Galaxies arcade owner Walter Day into wanting to track national high scores. His first nationwide high-score competition turned out to be for Defender in April 1982, held across 23 arcades in the US. The winner ended up being Rick Smith of Mission Viejo, California, with a score of 33 million points. And naturally, with such a huge arcade hit, there was money to be made in the home market. Atari managed to secure the rights to Defender and announced its impending home release at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in 1982. For the VCS version, the task fell to Bob Polaro. According to a 2011 interview with the podcast Retrogaming Roundup, Polaro graduated from SUNY with computer programming skills and cut his professional programming teeth at Adams System, before moving out west to work on writing games at Commodore for the PT computer. This led to him getting a job at Atari developing games for the 8-bit computer line. At one point, Atari management told him that they had enough games for the machine and would have to let him go unless he was open to writing games for the VCS. Polaro knew a bit of assembly and went for it. Around 1980, Polaro worked on an unreleased home conversion of Atari's extremely minor 1976 coin-op game, Stunt Cycle, as his first project, and a Dukes of Hazzard-themed modification to it that similarly never came out. From there, he started work on a VCS volleyball game, which similarly went unreleased until he revisited it with various enhancements to create real sports volleyball. According to his Retro Gaming Roundup interview, his next project after volleyball was shelved was Defender, which he started designing out on paper at the same time Todd Fry was designing Pac-Man. His manager asked if he could work on Pac-Man. Polaro decided to stick with Defender, he said, leaving Todd Fry to develop the Pac-Man we know today. Ironically, Polaro added that he was a terrible arcade Defender player and didn't quite grasp the game. And by the same token, Fry has noted in interviews that he didn't really like the arcade Pac-Man either. That said, most of the elements of the arcade game are still here. The enemies and their behavior, the long-range scanner, and the humanoid, now numbering 5 instead of 10. But there are some key differences. Even upon boot up, you can see the mountain landscape of the arcade game has been replaced with city high-rises. There are more changes that become apparent as you play the game. The Defender arcade machine, of course, has 6 buttons and an up-down lever to control your height, making it incredibly complex. This had the effect of making it appealing to hardcore players, but overwhelming to newcomers, and extremely difficult to port to the VCS's very limited controller. The VCS joystick still controlled vertical movement, but now was also responsible for forward thrust and for reversing direction by simply pushing left or right. Naturally, the controller button was used to fire the main laser. Hyperspace and smart bomb usage now became contextual. The ship can now scroll up off the top of the screen, at which point the button will cause a hyperspace jump, or down below the landscape, which will cause the button to set off a smart bomb. In a 1999 interview with Al Backiel for Digital Press, Polaro remarked that his solution was disliked by hardcore gamers as it didn't feel right, but that he'd heard over the years from a number of people who liked his version better due to the simplified controls. In a 2002 interview at the 3rd Philly Classic event, Polaro told Sarah Szefer of Atari Age that he managed all of the objects on the screen necessary for Defender by having the player's ship serve as one of the console's 2 player objects, and all the enemies flicker through, frame by frame, as the second object. When the laser is fired, it becomes the player's sprite object and your ship vanishes accordingly while the beam is active. A regular missile object used as a projectile in other VCS games cannot be stretched horizontally, so this was Polaro's solution to the problem. Polaro also had to try and emulate the soundscape of the arcade game since it is so vital to successfully know what's going on elsewhere in the world. He said in his 2011 interview that he felt the important sounds to focus on were the humanoid capture sound, the laser cannon, the hyperspace noise, and the startup audio, all of which found their way into the game within the VCS's meager audio capabilities. In all, Defender took about 6 months to wrap up. There are a few work-in-progress prototype builds that have made their way online in the years since the game came out, which provide an interesting window into development. The September 15th build has different colors and a variety of missing sounds, suggesting that Polaro was still working on these to get them to a satisfactory state. The later November build still has different colors and a different startup sound, but otherwise plays fairly close to the final version. While there are 20 different game types to select from in Defender, the options aren't as robust as one would expect. Rather, the game type adjusts how quickly landers pick up humanoids, how quickly the baiters and mutants move, your starting wave, and whether or not you're playing a mutant training mission, where you always fight on a humanoidless mutant hellscape. All of these feature 1 or 2 player options. There is also a children's mode on games 10 and 20, which reduces all of the enemy speed options to their lowest possible level, and leaves your foes as pretty much sitting ducks to get blasted. The difficulty switches adjust how quickly your ship can travel vertically, which is an interesting, albeit not particularly fun wrinkle for a game that is nowhere near as punishing as its arcade counterpart. Much as Polaro remarked, Defender for the VCS is a much easier game to manage and succeed at. Even someone who would struggle to clear 2 waves of the arcade game can probably make it to at least the 5th wave here. Enemies are not nearly as fast or aggressive, and the fact that you can't shoot the humanoids means your aim doesn't need to be as sharp when saving them. Furthermore, since your ship vanishes whenever your laser is fired, you can use this to your advantage and cause bullets to pass harmlessly through you by firing rapidly enough. Hyperspace no longer has the risk of death with it, but it's also not really as useful as a panic button since you have to fly off the top of the screen to use it. On the flip side, you can prep for a smart bomb by watching your long-range scanner for a good lineup of enemies while flying in the cityscape. Since you can't be shot while flying off screen on either end, it's a fairly safe way to get around, if not very true to the original game's brutal intent. Despite being somewhat easier though, this does still feel like Defender, if a bit stripped down. Once you get far enough into the game, the enemies begin to resemble their counterparts in terms of speed and aggression, and you'll likely find yourself relying on your invincibility while firing to make up for the fact that you can't just bomb or hyperspace on demand. This is another example of a VCS game that includes an Easter egg. On the 25th wave of Defender, if the player picks up a humanoid and flies to the 25th line of the playfield, around where you spawn in at the start of a level, all of the enemy objects will change to the initials BP for Bob Polaro. This is a pretty easy egg to activate if you can actually make it to wave 25, best attempted on the children's mode game types. As even if you're not looking for it, the enemy graphics will flicker over to BP momentarily when you cross that line. Atari's staff provided some background for the game in the manual, as was common at this time. It's also a fascinating time capsule into the search for extraterrestrial life that was in the zeitgeist at the time, with the ongoing SETI listening effort, the Arecibo message beamed out in 1974, the WOW signal being picked up by the Big Ear radio telescope in 1977, and the messages attached to the Voyager space probes. Here the conceit is that aliens have responded to these attempts at messaging by attacking Earth, with the intention of mutating humans and using them to take over the planet. It's a little dark, but the stakes are made clear. And speaking of strange time capsules, following on to the comic included with Yar's Revenge, this is the first VCS game of several to include an Atari Force comic book. These were developed by DC Comics, another subsidiary of Warner like Atari was, and ultimately 5 different issues would be included alongside games like Defender, Berserk, Star Raiders, Galaxian, and Phoenix. Atari Force would eventually spawn a full-sized comic book run, and while I'd be hard-pressed to say it has much to do with Atari games, it's an interesting example of corporate synergy and a neat inclusion with what Atari likely recognized to be their biggest hitters of the time period. Praise for Defender was practically universal upon its VCS debut. In the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Lou Hudson called it arguably the best effort Atari had produced for the platform with its sensible control scheme in action, adding that if you liked the arcade game, you'd like the home version. The July edition of the Video Game Update newsletter awarded Defender 3 stars for graphics and a maximum 4 stars in the gameplay category, remarking it as a much more faithful rendition than Pac-Man and a good game for people who love shooters. Logical Gamer reviewed Defender in its inaugural August 1982 edition, where reviewers Alan Bechtold and Mike Wilson called it a difficult job done well by Atari. They note that while the enemies could look a little closer to their arcade originals, they all stand out distinctly, and the game loop carries over addictingly well, indicating that any complaints they might have would just really be nitpicking. Jumping ahead to November, Electronic Games published its review of Defender with nothing but gushing praise. Declared the best game from Atari on the VCS since Missile Command, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz praised its use of sound effects, the minimal amount of flicker, and the accuracy of the play action when the compromises for the hardware are set aside. They also note that using a specialized all-button controller such as the Starplex can help emulate the arcade game's control scheme, but add that even with the standard joystick it plays well. Space Gamer also published its review in November, where Ed Driscoll similarly praises Atari for managing to carry over the complexity of the arcade game and the visual flair, even though the VCS simply can't match up to the arcade hardware. Joystick's review, published the following month, rated the game highly, with a magazine publishing a 3-page strategy section about the VCS port. Australian magazine Score notes that the game looks better in motion than in still images, plays fairly close to the arcade, and is one that no fan of the arcade game could be that disappointed by. In 1983, it won the Archie Award for Best Sci-Fi Game, with Kunkel and Katz remarking that had their rules permitted a game to win multiple awards, Defender's VCS port undoubtedly would have done so. All of Defender's acclaim, both in arcades and at home, likely contributed to its strong retail showing. According to Atari's internal sales memo, Defender was their third best-selling VCS game after Pac-Man and Space Invaders, selling more than 3 million copies in 1982. The same form does also indicate that the game had net negative sales of just under 69,000 units in 1983, amidst Atari's national return policy and the incredible amounts of overstocked product stores were dealing with at the time. In the twilight era of the VCS from 1986 through 1990, Defender sold a combined 33,894 copies, according to Atari's internal sales materials. A fairly reasonable showing for a game that appears to have suffered from crash-related overstock on top of being based on a then quite old arcade title. In the era of coin-op shooters like Gradius and R-Type, it's rather impressive Defender retained enough interest to manage those numbers. True enough to its big brother, there are also signs that Defender on the VCS got its share of high-score competitions. The Venture store chain in the Kansas City region ran ads in September leading up to a high-score contest it was hosting in a few different stores on October 2nd, apparently even getting a local radio station to cover the event. In Morristown, New Jersey, the Video Connection held a contest when the game came out, with the winner getting a free game and several membership perks. This is probably one of the better considered arcade conversions to the VCS today, as even with its limitations and changes, the core focus of Defender shines through. It's likely Polaro's own poor showing in Defender's coin-op original is a factor too. He produced here, if not an easy version of the game, then certainly the most approachable form it's ever been in. And of course, with the Defender rights, Atari wasn't going to just limit itself to the VCS. That December, Defender found its way to both the 8-bit computer line and the Atari 5200 console, which uses similar architecture. With the additional hardware capabilities and button availability, these versions look and play significantly closer to the arcade original. A year later, in December 1983, Atari expanded its Defender efforts further through its Atari Soft line of games for competing consoles and computers, publishing versions on the ColecoVision and Intellivision platforms in time for the Christmas season. Much like the Atari 8-bit takes, these retain the visual design and pacing of the arcade game, and utilize the keypads on both consoles' controllers to manage all the game's functions, even as movement followed Polaro's example and reduced it all to the joystick, or disc in the Intellivision's case. Through 1984, Defender also showed up on a massive swath of home computers, such as the Apple II, the Commodore VIC-20 and 64, the TI-99 4A, and the IBM PC. These had varying degrees of fidelity depending on the hardware platform, though generally were faithful to the arcade game, not being bound to the limitations of the VCS. Oddly, even on platforms that had 2 buttons, they often followed the VCS's controller example. The Apple II controller has 2 buttons, for example, but only one is used for anything. Hyperspace and Smart Bomb are managed on the keyboard like in the other computer ports. Atari revisited Defender on their own consoles a couple more times, first converting Stargate, Defender's arcade sequel, to the VCS in a remarkably high-fidelity yet awkward-to-play package, as the second controller is used to manage your hyperspace, smart bombs, and invisibility powers. Over a decade later, Jeff Minter led on Defender 2000 for the Atari Jaguar, a follow-up to the acclaimed Tempest 2000 that sought to update Defender in the same way. Whether or not it succeeded is certainly open to debate. It has all the difficulty of the arcade game, but in this case, that's in part to the sprites being massive. Much like other Minter projects, you really snowball in this one, either being able to steamroll multiple stages in one go, or getting blasted over and over again by the aggressive enemies. But the music is good. And unsurprisingly, Defender spawned a slew of clones and inspirational copies on home consoles and computers. Freedom Fighters on the Odyssey 2, for example, has you flying around dealing with enemy fire while trying to rescue humanoids floating through the void, though awkwardly also uses the second controller to scroll the screen. The go-to strategy therefore becomes relying on the primary controller to fight off enemy ships, and using the second one when attempting rescue operations. The Bally Professional Arcade saw Sea Devil from the Bit Fiddlers, and Cosmic Raiders from Astrocade, two of the last cartridge releases on the platform. Sea Devil, written by Andy Guevara and published by L&M Software, is a pretty straightforward if laid-back clone, where robot divers and poachers are after your abalone. Written by Guevara over the course of 6 months due to him being a massive fan of Defender. It wasn't a big seller though, as he told me that they moved less than 100 copies. He left game development not long afterwards. In retrospect, remarked that the game needed something more to have been really good, agreeing with an online review that found it to be mediocre. Cosmic Raiders differentiates itself a bit further from Defender by making the surface itself the object you're protecting, in this case against bombs being dropped from aliens. A big twist here are the energy stars that spawn in as you destroy bombs. Flying through them provides you with a temporary invincibility shield. Meanwhile, on computers, you had games like Jeff Minter's Andy's Attack on the VIC-20, or Drop Zone, a highly regarded and well-received clone originally written for the Atari 8-bit, and ported to the Commodore 64 and other platforms. And Atari didn't have the portable rights to the game, allowing Entex to release its own conversions in 1982, both as a standalone unit and as a cartridge for the Adventure Vision handheld. There are several interesting takes on Defender's style from third parties on the VCS, including a few we'll be seeing in the coming months, such as Stargunner from Telesys, Data Age's Bermuda Triangle, and Starpath's Killer Satellites. But perhaps the most well-known and most interesting of these Defender clones is the other June release we'll be looking at in this video, Chopper Command, from Activision. We can get it out of the way early. Chopper Command is Bob Whitehead's take on Defender, much as Stampede was his take on Space Invaders, or Boxing was a take on Atari's unreleased coin-op game Boxer. A straight ripoff, as Whitehead put it to me, though there are some very glaring differences between the two. Thematically, Chopper Command replaces the aliens with jets and helicopters, the humanoids with a convoy of trucks, and the player's spaceship with the titular chopper. The attackers are not trying to kidnap your trucks, but rather fire off shots that split vertically, making them a threat to you and to the trucks moving along on the surface, which the enemies are trying to destroy. You clear a wave by taking out all of the enemies, at which point you get bonus points for any surviving trucks. 100 points apiece multiplied by the wave number. Every 10,000 points, you earn a new chopper, up to a maximum of 6. One thing that is retained from Defender is your main laser weapon, which you can blissfully rapid fire by holding down the button. The position of the difficulty switch adjusts just how rapid that fire is. And as in Defender, a scanner on the bottom of the screen shows the relative height and positions of all the objects in the field, which is somewhat helpful for preparing for an attack run. And that's pretty much Chopper Command. The enemies will always hang out in a cluster of 3 above a group of trucks, flying left and right, firing shots. The trucks are always driving leftward, meaning if you just hang in one spot, you'll inevitably encounter the trucks and accompanying enemies. This may all sound fairly manageable, but the game ramps up in difficulty in a way that calls to mind the coin-op Defender rather than Atari's own home effort. For each wave, the action speeds up, giving you increasingly little room for error and avoiding getting rammed by an enemy. Strategies from folks on Atari Age's forums suggest the best approach is to clear out the enemies closest to the ground first, and then, depending on the wave, either moving on to the next group or carefully working your way up vertically. The 4 game types basically let you decide if 1 or 2 players are stunning at wave 1 or at a max speed wave, making this a pretty focused experience. Like many other Activision games, there's a patch that could be awarded here too. By scoring at least 10,000 points and sending in a photo of the screen, a player could earn the Chopper Command Commandos patch. It's interesting to see how Whitehead and Activision approached a Defender-style game compared to Polaro and Atari. Of course, Whitehead was not bound by the desire to make something resembling the coin-op original, which is likely a factor in how this game is able to run flicker-free. You have the gorgeous Activision sunset again, as seen previously in March's Barnstorming. Visually, the game is incredibly colorful and appealing compared to Atari's Defender, and shifting directions from left to right is smoother here as well, though that is actually rather unlike the arcade game. But it's also a much simpler game than Defender, as there's no real penalty for losing your trucks outside of not getting bonus points. and the enemy attack patterns are pretty straightforward. It may have the pacing and intensity of the coin-op Defender, but it suffers a bit in the longevity department. These shortcomings and strengths are also reflected in the contemporary coverage. In Space Gamer, reviewer Richard Edwards remarked that the graphics and sound are up to Activision standards, but it ultimately is a pretty basic shooting game that one may be hard-pressed to get very far into. In Logical Gamer's second issue, Alan Bechtold praises the graphics and responsiveness of the controls and notes that it is a fun, challenging experience, but lamented the lack of originality that he'd come to expect from Activision's output, as this was just so similar to Defender. Mike Wilson largely agreed, really only digging it for the lack of options that other games at the time tended to have. Video Game Update, on the other hand, gave Chopper Command a perfect 4 stars on both graphics and gameplay, writing that it features best ever graphics on the VCS, realistic audio, and a lot of shooting action and strategy. In score, Chopper Command was reviewed as to be treated as a true challenge with superb graphics. And for what it's worth, Eugene Jarvis reportedly was a fan, calling Chopper Command a better Defender ripoff than the official Atari VCS Defender game in Joystick magazine. In Electronic Games, the game is called one of the most entertaining cartridges of the year and indicate that the stellar audio design elevates the experience into one of the most exciting games available. Gunkel and Katz also awarded Chopper Command Best Action Game in the 1983 Archie Awards, rating that players needed a strong trigger finger for it, and Electronic Games even devoted a whole strategy article to scoring well in it. On the other end of the spectrum, Lou Hudson with the Fort Worth Star Telegram dinged the game as being a cash-in on Defender, which was fine, save for the fact that Atari's own Defender cartridge was better, as Chopper Command lacked the diabolical complexity of the original. There are no available sales figures for Chopper Command, though Whitehead remembered it selling rather well, pushing 1 million as he put it, though not quite reaching those rarefied heights. In the Australian magazine Score, an interview with Jim Levy suggests that Chopper Command was one of Activision's strongest-selling games at the time, alongside Pitfall and Star Master, though he provides no specifics. Levy names off Activision's million-plus sellers in a later interview printed in Antic from 1984, where Chopper Command doesn't come up, so Whitehead's recollection is likely accurate. Some retailer information from Software Merchandising circa October 1982 suggests that both Chopper Command and Defender were quite popular. While Defender-style games such as Resogun have emerged periodically, the Defender name itself has lain dormant for over 20 years since a 2002-era console remake that reimagines it as a third-person air combat title. The Williams video game library now lies with Warner Bros. Discovery, a company that, as of this writing, has proceeded to do absolutely nothing with its legacy games since an Xbox 360-era arcade compilation. Chopper Command has done only marginally better, with appearances on the dedicated Atari flashback consoles, but the VCS version of Defender has been trapped in rights oblivion since the platform ended official support in 1992. It's a shame all around, as both of these games are excellent examples of what 1982 had to offer and hold up remarkably well even now. Next time, we take on the Empire all by ourselves.